Ah, hello again. Having trouble sleeping, are we? No matter. I'm sure I have something here for you to doze off to. Have you ever felt so angry that you simply died? No. Well, that makes one of us. It's 375 AD, and Valentinian is at the height of his power. Right now, he's on a campaign taming the various Germanic tribes that opposed the Empire. His victory looked certain. However, it was a conversation with the Quadi that didn't play into his favor. To quote the Wikipedia page, the envoys insisted that the conflict was caused by the building of Roman forts in their lands. Furthermore, individual bands of Quadi were not necessarily bound to the rule of the chiefs who had made treaties with the Romans, and thus might attack the Romans at any time. The attitude of the envoys so enraged Valentinian that he suffered a burst blood vessel in the skull while angrily yelling at them, provoking his death on November 17, 375. Essentially, he died yelling at a bunch of Germans, a very classic Italian death. Apologies, dear listener. Was the last story too macabre? Let me see. Ah, yes. The story of Publius Claudius Pulcher and his chickens. Let's jump back to 249 BCE, during the First Punic War. Tensions are running high, and the outcome of a crucial naval battle between the Roman Republic and Carthaginian Empire hangs in the balance. In the Roman world, omens were a big deal, and the behavior of sacred chickens played a pivotal role in making such decisions. Publius Claudius Pulcher, a Roman consul and military commander, finds himself faced with a difficult decision. He needs to determine whether the omens are favorable for a naval engagement against the Carthaginians. These sacred chickens were kept aboard Roman warships. Their role: to peck at grains placed in special divination boards. If the chickens eagerly consumed the grains, it was seen as a positive omen, a sign from the gods that victory was imminent. But if they showed disinterest or refused to eat, it was considered a bad omen, and the battle would likely be postponed. The chickens, unfortunately, weren't keen on the grain. A hasty retreat should have followed. But alas, what is bravery without a dash of recklessness? Pulcher decided to ignore the uncooperative chickens and ordered the fleet into battle. Now, the outcome of the battle was disastrous, utterly tragic, I'd say. Pulcher's fleet suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Carthaginians. It was a catastrophic loss, and it left the Romans in shock. Pulcher's bold move had backfired spectacularly. So, was Publius Claudius Pulcher a fearless maverick or a reckless fool? Well, would you believe in the poultry prophecy? The Romans were quite fond of prophetic animals. This story takes place in 390 BC, and the city of Rome is facing a dire threat. Gauls, a fierce group of Celtic warriors, have descended upon the city in what would later be known as the Sack of Rome. The Gauls took to one of the city gates by cover of night. They were hoping to surprise the Romans, but a group of sacred geese began to honk and squawk loudly. Their raucous noise echoes through the night, alerting the Roman guards to the imminent danger. Geese were seen as the mediums between the mortals and the gods, and this divine intervention was all that was needed. Awakened by the cacophony of the geese, the Roman defenders rushed to the gates, where they're able to repel the Gauls and save the city from certain destruction. Some have speculated that the sacred geese were kept within the temple of Juno, the goddess of protection, and were known for their vigilant nature. Others suggest that their heightened sensitivity to sound allowed them to detect the approaching Gauls before the guards did. We may never know the full extent of the geese's role in this dramatic rescue. Ah, the horse. I promise, dear listener, this will be the last for these animal-inspired stories. Have you ever heard of a leader who took the term political horseplay to a whole new level? Emperor Caligula took this literally. With all his eccentricities, was not too out of the ordinary for him. It seemed he had a deep affection for his horse, Incitatus. But this wasn't just your average love for a pet. No, Caligula took it to the next level. He believed that Incitatus deserved a place among the Roman Senate, one of the most prestigious political bodies in history. Whether this was a display of insanity or a satire, he certainly had the means to follow through. So what did Caligula do? He appointed Incitatus as a senator, complete with a marble stall, an ivory manger, and even a house. That's right, a horse with a house. But it didn't stop there. Caligula insisted that Incitatus be addressed as Senator Incitatus, and be treated with all the respect and privileges of a Roman senator. At least, that's what would have happened, if not for Caligula's assassination. Perhaps if Caligula wasn't such a controversial figure and got off his high horse, his equestrian friend could have shared a seat in the Senate. Since we're on the topic of Caligula, I suppose we can discuss this fun tidbit as well. Imagine yourself as a high-ranking senator. You've finally made it to the tip-top of Roman high society. Give yourself a pat on the back, champ. Unfortunately, your emperor is utterly insane and strange in a not-so-endearing way. You receive a summons in the dead of night. Caligula wants to see you. Normally, this means death. Who summons their consul at night, and for what reason? Death would have been an easier way out. No, unfortunately for you, a robed Caligula arrives and begins to dance. He dances with such tenacity and determination that you simply must watch him. He'd surely kill you if you don't. The silent solo disco abruptly ends, and before you can take in the treachery that has occurred, Caligula takes his leave. Good grief. Believe me, dear listener, this is just scratching the surface on the strange fellow that is Caligula. Sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Other times it's greed. If you're really unlucky, it's a mix of both. During the reign of Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorian Guards felt that a raise was justified. Inflation was on the rise, and their wages simply did not keep up with the times. The following events occurred. The Guards petitioned a raise. Pertinax refused. He was promptly murdered after. The Praetorians thought to themselves, how can we have an empire without an emperor? Ah yes, we'll simply auction the office of emperor to the highest bidder. This, dear listener, was a classic blunder. They still had no raise, and the next emperor, Didius Julianus, was a bumbling idiot. During his 66 days in power, he devalued the Roman currency and lost the favor of all of the Senate. In the end, Didius Dulanus was executed, and the Praetorian Guards were disbanded. Oh, here's a fun one. Are you familiar with Caesar's second most famous words? No? Lovely. It was, "The die is cast." He uttered this fateful turn of phrase after crossing the Rubicon River with his troops, an illegal act and a de facto declaration of war. In many fictional adaptations of this event, these words are spoken with much seriousness and gravitas. But it is likely that Caesar was quoting a Greek comedy, and the line is better translated as, "Well, the dice are in the air now." Caesar, after making one of the most momentous acts in Western history, cracked a joke. Who was Julian the Apostate? He was a Roman emperor who ruled from 361 to 363 AD, and he's often remembered for his attempt to revive traditional Roman paganism and challenge the growing influence of Christianity. But we're not talking about that today. Instead, we're briefly discussing his satirical writing toward the city of Antioch. In a time where it was common to be clean-shaven, he sported a long beard. This proved to be a point of discussion among the people of Antioch, ridiculing and laughing at him. To put into perspective, I'll leave you with this excerpt from his book. "For though nature did not make this any too handsome or well-favored, or give it the bloom of youth, I myself, out of sheer perversity and ill temper, have added to it this long beard of mine. To punish it, as it would seem, for this very crime of not being handsome by nature. For the same reason, I put up with the lice that scamper about in it, as though it were a thicket for wild beasts. As for eating greedily or drinking with my mouth wide open, it is not in my power. For I must take care, I suppose, or before I know it, I shall eat up some of my own hairs along with my crumbs of bread. In the matter of being kissed and kissing, I suffer no inconvenience whatsoever, and yet for this, as for other purposes, a beard is evidently troublesome, since it does not allow me to press shaven lips to other lips more sweetly, because they are smooth, I suppose, as has been said already by one of those who, with the aid of Pan and Calliope, composed poems in honor of Daphnis. But you say that I ought to twist ropes from it. Well, I am willing to provide you with ropes, if only you have the strength to pull them, and their roughness does not do dreadful damage to your unborn and tender hands. And let no one suppose that I am offended by your satire, for I myself furnish you with an excuse for it by wearing my chin as goats do, when I might, I suppose, make it smooth and bare, as handsome youths wear theirs, and all women, who are endowed by nature with loveliness. But you, since even in your old age, you emulate your own sons and daughters by your soft and delicate way of living, or perhaps by your effeminate dispositions, carefully make your chins smooth, and your manhood you barely reveal, and slightly indicate by your foreheads, not by your jaws, as I do. Rome doesn't exist. At least, not its origin story. Between fact and fiction, it errs towards the latter. Welcome back, dear listener, to another collection of tales surrounding ancient Rome. Many people accredit Romulus and Remus for finding Rome. The two were born between a Vestal virgin, Rhea, and Mars, the god of war. To claim pregnancy via godly means was, well, skeptical at best. Their mother wasn't meant for children. I mean, the name Vestal Virgin implies something that is on the nose, but what do I know? Rhea left her children by the Tiber River to die, but through divine intervention or fantastical storytelling, this was not their end. Mars, their godly father, sent two of his familiars, a she-wolf and woodpecker, to raise them into good health. They were nurtured by the two until a shepherd discovered the feral boys and fostered them as his own. Over time, they learned of their true nature. Their mother was the daughter of King Numitor, who laid claim on the land until his brother Amulius usurped him. Fearful of any challenge to his throne, Amulius forced Rhea to chastity by becoming a Vestal virgin. The boys saw this as their call to action and took up arms against their great uncle. They won. This victory was cut short, for a quarrel between the two brothers had occurred. Who would lead the people now? Certainly I, said Romulus. No, most definitely me, retorted Remus. This ended with Remus dead and Rome being founded on the Palatine Hill by the Tiber, where the two had been saved as babies years prior. Now, did this actually happen? In all likelihood, probably not. Lupa in Latin can translate to she-wolf or prostitute, and indicated the supposed twins were of a less than noble background. To be raised by wolves is a common idiom to point out someone particularly uncouth, an idea that wasn't lost on the Romans. It's naive to believe two orphan boys were the son of a great king, much less demigod kin. Titus Livy is one of the more well-known Roman historians, and even his accounts note that Romulus's mother merely claimed that her twins were the sons of Mars, and suggests it was a ruse to cover up an illicit affair. Even in his preface for A History of Rome, he states, "Such traditions as belong to the time before the city was founded, and are rather adorned with poetic legends than based upon trustworthy historical proofs, I purpose neither to affirm nor refute. It is the privilege of antiquity to mingle divine things with human, and so to add dignity to the beginnings of cities." The etymology of Romulus also implies he wasn't a real person. While in a present-day context, I signifies a man's origin, like in Romani, Iulus was the archaic suffix used. Romulus could very well just mean man from Rome, and not be the name of the man himself. Tell me, does that not sound silly? Was the United States of America founded by a Mr. America? Close. It was named after Amerigo Vespucci, but I digress. When history as ancient as this is recalled in present times, it's easier to attest the victories of the many to the few. Who founded Rome? Romulus. Who was the first king? Romulus. Need I go on? Still, while the myths retell an inaccurate founding of Rome, it is seldom a boring story. And it's not like Romans themselves believed these myths. It was just that, a myth. Educated Romans freely saw Romulus as an allegory, not unlike reckoned tales, and endorsed the simple reason that these myths were central to the literary canon of Rome. Romulus and Remus, reduced to myth, but could never be relegated to oblivion. We find ourselves with the question that comes to every rising young man. How do I approach women? You see, when Romulus founded Rome, he welcomed it to any and all, a town that would extend its hospitality to any and everyone. The caveat is that this attracted a colorful sort. Scoundrels, cutthroats, and every ilk of bad blood found themselves in Rome. To be fair, what would attract any do-gooder here? The Etruscans to the north already had an established and wealthy settlement, and Greece in the south was a cultural hub for travelers and tourists. Rome had a lot of competition and was doing abysmally in comparison to its neighbors. In the early stages, there were no women. It was a dude fest, the equivalent of a middle school boys' locker room. Romulus had to MacGyver a way to bring women to his settlement, and brute force would not suffice. You see, he devised a scheme. Romulus hosted a festival for Neptune, the god of the sea, and invited their Sabine neighbors. Previous diplomatic encounters proved less than fruitful, so an act of good faith was needed. Or so the Romans had them believe. This scheme was so cartoonishly wicked that it made my milk curdle, dear listener. It was simple. Get the Sabines drunk, and when they're too inebriated, we abduct the women and boot the rest of them out. Bingo bango, that was it. The Romans waited for their king to give the signal, and with a swift gesture of his cloak, they sprung their attack. And it worked. Romulus, the mad lad, had done it. In a frenzy, the Romans descended on their drunken neighbors. Obviously, the Sabine women were not too pleased by their predicament, but the Romans were rather persuasive. Their reasoning was that they'd take extra care of their new wives because they feel so guilty of what had occurred. We could argue that this is a class example of Lima syndrome. The captors are now sympathizing with their victims, acting as if they had not just taken these virgin women away from their homes and loved ones and forced them into this new life. The aftermath of the Sabine festival was a delicate situation for Rome. They now had Sabine women as their wives, and the Sabine men, their previous neighbors, were not pleased. War was imminent, and both sides were prepared for a violent clash. The Sabines marched into Roman territory, led by their king Titus Tatius. In an act of treason, Tarpeia, daughter of Roman governor Spurius Tarpeius, opened the city gates for the Sabines. She did this in return for what they bore on their arms, thinking it be gold. But alas, in a cruel irony, Tarpeia was the first to die, being crushed by the Sabine shields and thrown from a rock. The two sides fought. The Sabine women, who were caught in the middle, had a different plan. They had grown attached to their Roman husbands and didn't want to see their families at war. Ercilia, a Sabine woman and wife of Romulus, was able to nurture a peace treaty. The two sides brokered a peace and decided to merge their two cities together. Romulus and Titus were co-rulers of the Roman Sabine kingdoms, until Titus met an untimely death 5 years later, leaving Romulus to rule all on his lonesome. Now then, did this event really take place? Well, depending on who you ask, it depends. Scholars such as Livy, Dionysius, and Cicero all say yes, this did happen. The reasonings, however, differed. According to Livy, the Roman motivation for abducting the Sabine women were solely to increase the population and claimed no form of assault, be it sexual or otherwise. Romulus declared that it was all owing to the pride of their parents in denying the right of intermarriage to their neighbors. They would live in honorable wedlock and share all their property and civil rights, and, dearest of all to human nature, would be the mothers of free men. Cicero agreed with Livy, stating it was necessary to strengthen the new state, suggesting this event never took place and was mere propaganda to tell tales of Rome's power. After the Samnite War in 4th century BC, this story would have been told to explain the assimilation of Rome's many neighbors, adhering to their military prowess. Coins minted around 89 BC also displayed the Sabine festival in all its glory. Surely a story showcasing Rome's capacity for brutal violence, but ultimately holding back after the submission of the Sabines, would have been a powerful story to tell any and all that would oppose Rome. Whether it is fact or fiction, the same principles apply here like they did with the origins of Rome. These myths were central to the story of Rome, and regardless of its authenticity, could never be forgotten into obscurity. All things come to an end, even to those gifted by the gods. After a reign of 40 years, Romulus was swept up in a whirlwind during a violent storm, never to be seen again. The throne was empty, and the Romans searched far and wide for their king, but couldn't find him. Some say he ascended into godhood. Others suggested he fled the city to start anew. Needless to say that none of this is true. It's more likely that, in typical Roman fashion, he was assassinated by his senators so they could elect a new king. That is, assuming he existed at all. But then again, most of early Roman history is more myth than reality. Imagine a life where being a cabbage farmer was enough to meet your needs. It seems like a far-fetched dream, but a long time ago, in an empire far, far away, this wasn't the case. Rome was a prosperous place where merchants, soldiers, and peasants could live off their trade. But how much do we know about their day-to-day? What really went on? I'm glad you asked, dear listener. Describing the occupations of an average Roman citizen is challenging due to the limited demography of their population. The surviving historical records represent only a small fraction of what the Romans left behind, offering a somewhat skewed perspective on their society. The existing letters and books have been preserved primarily through the efforts of various monks, philosophers, and Arabian scholars, but these documents tend to focus more on storytelling and anecdotes rather than raw analytical data. Mind you, it's essential to recognize the inherent bias in these texts. Unlike today, finding the opinion of your average Joe isn't as easy as looking up their social media or doing a quick Google search. First-hand accounts from the likes of slaves and commoners are seldom seen, much less preserved. A majority of our sources come from prominent figures like Seneca and Galen, who belonged to the aristocracy. Historians are trained to read between the lines, yet the lack of comprehensive data poses a significant obstacle, as we cannot travel back in time to gather more information. Within these passages, there are references to certain professions, often mentioned in the context of complaints. These include armpit pluckers, masseuses, confectioners, cake sellers, sausage makers, food vendors, carriage drivers, litter bearers, saw sharpeners, and aspiring musicians. It's important to consider the role of slaves in these professions, seeing as they made up a substantial portion of the population. Slaves performed a wide range of jobs, from menial tasks to what we consider white collar. Making up the backbone of Roman society, they could be assigned to virtually any job imaginable. This, of course, led to a hierarchy among the slaves. Not all were created equal. The vicari were the slaves that held power over other slaves. These people were often well educated, coming from Grecian settlements, and could read and write. Within a wealthy household, the vicari acted as the second hand of the master, managing and looking over all the other slaves within the home. Some slaves, like the imperial secretaries, even commanded more respect than many freeborn citizens. The construction of the Colosseum itself was completed by slaves working under the guidance of foremen, who were likely also slaves. These foremen received instructions from architects about whom we have limited information, but it's likely they could have all been slaves as well. See what I'm getting at? Who runs the world? Slaves. Well, not really, but for the upper middle class and onwards, slaves could do the work for you if you could afford it. The prevalence of slaves in a specific profession depended on the financial capacity of individuals in that field. While emperors had seemingly limitless resources to command grand projects that required thousands of workers, common citizens, such as bakers or dyers, might not have had the means to afford slaves for their work. Apologies. It seems I've gone on a tangent yet again. If I had to pick a stereotypical job, it'd most definitely be either construction or farming. construction because rich people loved building things. Well, they still do. And slaves were more expensive than free labor. Oftentimes, an unskilled worker could pick up a trade and learn it with hands-on experience at the cost of no guaranteed wages. This policy also stemmed into farming, because how else are the people of Rome going to eat? For reference, the Roman Empire had a population of 45 million and spanned over 2 million square miles across Europe during the reign of Emperor Augustus. That's a whole lot of mouths to feed. So, let's say you got a construction job working on the Aqua Tepula, or as a silk merchant with imported goods from China. Congratulations. Oh, you're wondering what the traffic was like. Is it as abysmal as traversing a city with modern-day traffic? Perhaps. The decree against large carts on the street during specific hours certainly implies this. In the roads which are or shall be within the city of Rome, or within the limit of continuous habitation, no person, after the first day of January next following, shall be allowed in the daytime, after sunrise or before the 10th hour of the day, to lead or drive any heavy wagon, except where it shall be requisite, for the sake of building the sacred temples of the immortal gods, or carrying out some public work, to draw or convey material into the city, or where, in pursuance of a contract for the demolition of buildings, it shall be requisite for public ends to carry the material out of the city, or away from such places, and in cases and for objects for the which it shall be lawful, for specified persons and for specified causes, to lead or drive wagons. On all days when the Vestal Virgins, the Rex Sacrorum, and the Flamins shall be required to ride in wagons in the city for the sake of the public sacrifices of the Roman people, or when wagons shall be required for a triumphal procession on the day fixed for such triumph, or for games which shall be publicly celebrated within the city of Rome, or within 1 mile of the city, or for the procession at the Ludi, Circenses, for all such causes, and on all such days, it shall be lawful for wagons to be led or driven in the city in the daytime, notwithstanding any enactments in this law. It shall be lawful for wagons, brought into the city by night, drawn by oxen or horses, if returning empty or conveying away refuse, to be in the city of Rome, or within 1 mile of the city after sunrise, in the first 10 hours of the day, notwithstanding any enactments in this law. Pretty standard legalese here. Don't have your carts out during the day or special events, and keep everything tidy, yada yada. On paper, none of this sounds bad until you realize just how wretched the infrastructure was. You see, Rome was not as well built as cities like Alexandria or New York, which were built on a grid. No, dear listener, it was a glorious mess. Roadblocks were put out to keep wagons on designated roads. There were also gates placed within the cities that each merchant had to go through before getting into the city. These gates were a bottleneck for traffic, reminiscent of waiting in line at airport security or paying a toll on the highway. Picture this. You're a hypothetical merchant. Your day would start at the break of dawn as you journey toward one of the city gates. You wait in a terribly long and cramped line as Roman guards check your wares and charge you a toll before entering the city. You never liked the guards. They'd always poke fun at you. Oh, you're a cabbage farmer. As if anyone cares about your cabbages. They laugh in your face and charge you the aureus equivalent of a day's work. You shrug it off. Once you enter the city, the poor infrastructure and unkempt cobblestone streets make it hard for your wagon and horse to navigate. One of your wheels has cracked from the cobblestone. Cripes. Your horse is looking a little displeased as well. It seems like the local delinquents are causing a ruckus again. throwing stone at passers-by and making awfully coarse comments about your hair. Oh, apologies. It seems I've gotten carried away again. The point is that it was grueling work to get into the city. Roman historian Livy puts it as such. The proposed measure for migration was dropped, and they began to rebuild the city in a haphazard way. Tiling was provided at the public expense. Everyone was given the right to cut stone and timber where he pleased, after giving security that the building should be completed within the year. In their haste, they took no trouble to plan out straight streets. As all distinction of ownership in the soil were lost, they built on any ground that happened to be vacant. That is the reason why the old sewers, which originally were carried under public ground, now run everywhere under private houses, and why the conformation of the city resembles one casually built upon by settlers, rather than one regularly planned out. Rome was built by the Tiber, which was difficult to work with. The rolling hills and twisting river didn't help in the back-end construction of sewage systems, waterways, and building foundations. With a high population density and low space, you get the sense that early Rome was a very cramped city. It was not uncommon for wagon drivers to hire thugs to accompany them during their journey to the marketplaces, hurling insults and shoving people to move out of oncoming traffic. Was this legal? Actually, yes. At the time, there were no traffic regulations that we know of, so any and all means of transportation shortcuts were used with varying effectiveness. What we see today as the spectacle fights of the Colosseum stemmed from a quieter origin. Bear with me, dear listener, for the history of early Rome and its gladiators is shrouded in a mix of fact and fiction. Perhaps more of a 60-40 split. One can never be too sure. The early fights leaned more toward the practice of religion rather than entertainment. They were funerary rites first and foremost, an elegant and rather expensive way to commemorate the dead by having 2 or more slaves participate in feats of courage. And what better way to display courage than through blood sports? These munera, or games, typically had gladiators fight to the death to honor a war general or wealthy aristocrat. It's believed that spilling blood would put the deceased's soul at ease, an irony that must have flown through a gladiator's head as they fight to keep their own. So when did these events first take place? To that, I say, I don't know. Were you there? I certainly wasn't. Some historians argue that the practice originated from Rome's Etruscan neighbors, yet there's evidence of gladiatorial combat existing before the Etruscan assimilation into Rome. During the First Punic War in 264 BCE, Decimus Junior Brutus held a munus, the first existing documentation of gladiatorial combat. In the heart of Rome's Forum Boarium, Brutus honored his father in, at the time, an unconventional way. An oval surface filled with sand was erected in the center of the Boarium, with his father's funeral pyre alongside it. 3 pairs of slaves, adorned in the armor of the Samnites, Gauls, and Thracians, fought in the sandpit until half lay dead. The first few munera were private events, often taking place in someone's home or courtyard. However, these blood sports always seemed to draw a crowd, and a shift to move these funerary rites to public areas became more commonplace. Spectators often crowded around the oval arena, and it was not unheard of to construct temporary wooden amphitheaters for the bigger events. As time progressed, the allure of the gladiators grew ever more present. Aristocrats realized they could gain favor with the populace by hosting gladiator games. The bigger the event, the better their approval. It was during the reign of Julius Caesar in 90 BCE that an evident shift from funerary rites to monthly Colosseum entertainment became the norm. Believe you me, dear listener, these games were the talk of the town when they occurred. It's said that Caesar held a game with over 300 gladiators to honor his dead father, a grandiose event that at the time had never been seen before. By now, the gladiator fights had become a whole-day event. The climactic mano a mano was perpended by a series of games that started in the morning, giving the crowd a show and amping up expectations before the big event. There's enough for an entire episode on this topic, so I'll just give a quick debrief. The first event had a bestiary, or venato, go toe-to-toe with exotic animals like lions, tigers, elephants, and whatever wonders of the world the Romans felt like killing that day. There was mix between trained fighters slaying a beast from a distance, and helpless slaves and prisoners of war being slaughtered by a wide assortment of animals. Following this were the executions. This ranged from reenacting depictions of war, certain Christ-like crucifixions, or having an animal crush a prisoner by their sheer weight. A break at noon often occurred, with people taking time to stretch, grab concessions, get drunk, and fight in the stands, or anything we'd do at modern-day sporting events. There are records of certain humorous events taking place as well. Trained monkeys riding on donkeys, gladiators being blindfolded before going into the arena, and naval battles to reenact certain Roman victories were all forms of entertainment that would take place during a munera. The fight itself between 2 gladiators was more for show rather than to kill one another. Think of it like a WWE fight. It'd be a tad strange to watch John Cena kill The Undertaker. Indeed, dear listener, the Romans were civilized. A straightforward execution would be too cruel. The more humane option would be to pit 2 slaves against one another in the Colosseum for all of Rome to see. Put on a good show, embellish your attacks, draw a cheeky bit of blood, and there you have it. The crowd cheered and the gladiators got to die another day. So, who exactly were these gladiators? To be blunt, they were slaves. The bottom of the barrel. Slaves were prisoners of war and auctioned in public. The more educated slaves, like those from Greece, served as tutors for children of nobility. Others were servants, farm hands, or anything else that the Romans didn't want to do manually themselves. The gladiators were chosen because they were either capable fighters or they simply looked the part. Those in the ranks of the gladiators were outcast. Whether they were prisoners, convicts, or lowlives, no one wanted to associate with them. They were infamous and were closer to property than people. Social isolation followed, as association with an infamous often led to one being considered an infamous themselves. As a gladiator, you could not hold office, own land, or vote. A gladiator's entire being was owned by their lanista. There were occasions of emperors and aristocrats joining the gladiator ranks, but this was seldom seen for the variety of reasons mentioned earlier. Once a slave was chosen to become a gladiator, they were moved to a ludus. This would be their home until they died or were freed by the sword. Imagine an austere home, one far removed from the splendor of Rome's grandeur. The ludus was a place of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless training. Within these walls, a grueling existence awaited the swordsmen, shaping them into the formidable combatants of the arena. Life here would be a repetition of combat drills, physical training, and eating. So honestly, not too bad. By the late Republic, it wasn't uncommon to hear of free men joining the gladiator pits to escape debt, poverty, or the boredoms of a privileged life. But I digress. Point being, you were fed and taken care of, much like how cattle is taken care of until they're not needed. New recruits were called novicius and would be assessed by the lanista, the doctores, and the medici. The lanista was the end-all be-all for the gladiators. Usually an ex-gladiator themselves, the lanista's word was law, and they were responsible for renting out the gladiators to events and games. They'd be the ones compensated when their gladiators died, which seldom happened. The big tariff for killing another also helped death in the arena be a rare occurrence. The doctores were the weapon specialists. They oversaw the training regiment for the novicius, honing their skills in specific combat styles. The medici were the doctors for the ludus. Galen, a Greek physician, was one of the more famous medici. His documentation on gladiator livelihood is one of the reasons we can understand them with such great detail. Good job, guy. A normal day would be to wake up before the sun rises and train until the sun sets. They were on a tetrad training regimen, a 4-day cycle that consisted of high-intensity interval training, full-body workouts, and combat drills. It'd be very silly to give new recruits weapons, and as such they trained with wooden swords, a rudis. This sword was twice as heavy as a normal one, making it extra difficult for the novicius to wield. This also ensured the trainee would build the upper body and arm strength expected from a gladiator. A wooden pole, known as a palos, served as a novicius's training partner. This way, the new recruits could get acquainted with practicing various maneuvers without imposing any serious harm on an opponent. When the initial training concluded, the novicius were promoted to tiro, meaning they were combat ready. They'd be moved into class-specific barracks and only train with others that specialized in their fighting styles. Mind you, dear listener, there were a lot of gladiator types, more than we have history of. As such, I'll just cover the popular 4 that were considered the principal classes: the Samnites, Thrax, Myrmilo, and Retiarius. I'd like to sidetrack with this fun little tidbit. Most info about gladiators is secondhand. It's mostly from historians, with Galen, a Greek physician, being one of the more popular sources. The following is derived from a chapter of Oneirocritica, a book written not by Galen, but by one of his contemporaries, Artemidorus. He was a diviner for 2nd century Rome, meaning at times he interpreted people's dreams. In this chapter, he's analyzing what kind of woman a man would marry based off of the gladiator he fought in his dreams. While reading Peter Thoneman's translation and commentary of Oneirocritica, I found this particular quote funny. Gladiators and athletes can be grouped together as classes of person for whom dreams of breastfeeding are profoundly inauspicious. But the social status of gladiators was immeasurably lower than that of athletes. Anywho, let's talk gladiators. The Samnites were the heavy hitters of the gladiator caste. The Samnites were warriors from Samnium and were some of the first gladiators to be introduced around the 4th century BC. They were instantly recognizable with their plumed crest on their helmet. Armed with a long wooden scutum and a gladius, they were very resilient and could not be easily downed head-on. Their leg greaves and shoulder pads covered up any body part that couldn't be covered by their shield. By the time of Augustus, the Samnites were allies, and the name was changed to Scooter, the class that Emperor Commodus competed as. They'd normally fight against more agile opponents like the Retiarius, although occasional battles with the heavily armed Mirmilo occurred. The Thrax, or Thracian, were a more nimble version of the Scooter. Named after the Thracians, the Thrax were one of Rome's earliest enemies. Artemidorus warned that if a man fought a Thrax in his dreams, his wife would be wealthy because of Thrax's armor, crafty due to his curved scimitar, and fond of being first because of Thrax's advancing techniques. While this is just pure speculation on Artemidorus's part, the dreams, everything stated about the Thrax was accurate. They'd often be fought in pairs against a Mirmilo. These lightly armored foes held a curved sword and parmula, a small shield that could offer both protection and mobility. Layered greaves covered the legs and arms, but the chest was left bare. Unlike the other fighters, the Thrax were left-handed, providing a unique advantage because most gladiators were trained to block right-handed attacks. The Retiarius was a crowd favorite in 1st century Rome. These were the lads walking into the arena with just a trident and net. Apart from their loincloth and shoulder pad, they were essentially naked. Having no defense, the goal was to ensnare the opponent in a net and finish them off with the trident. Artemidorus believed that if you dreamt of fighting a Retiarius, your wife, for lack of better words, would be a whore. She'd be poor and wanton, roaming about for any man to find her. The Mirmilo served as foil to the Retiarius. Their fish-shaped helmet with small eye holes prevented the prongs from the tridents, and the heavy armor adorned in scales protected the exposed arms and shoulder. Much like the Scooter, Mirmilo wore heavy armor, held a Roman straight sword, had shin guards and a shield that offered more protection than mobility. Oh? What's that? You're curious about what the gladiators ate? Why, dear listener, I'm glad you brought that up. To fuel their intense lifestyle, gladiators adhered to a high-calorie diet. A staple of the gladiators' diet was grains, particularly barley and wheat. So much so that a name for them was cordiri, which, depending on who you asked, meant eaters of barley, or my preferred translation, barley boys. A typical meal would consist of porridge, beans, and fruit. Honey and vinegar were in their sports drinks to replenish electrolytes. A calcium drink made of charred bones and plants was also cited to be among their diet. Water, of course, was the preferred liquid. However, on the rare occasion they'd have meat, typically whatever animal died that day at the arena, but this was a rare event. Gladiators were still at the bottom of the social circle, and as such didn't get access to meats. Anywho, I feel like this has gone on for far too long. If you're still awake, maybe try starting again from the top, or check out another episode on our app. Up to you, really. We will most definitely talk about Gladiators again, dear listener. Fret not your little heart. If this notice was too alarming for you, I apologize. I'll read to you this letter from the philosopher Seneca and his rather pessimistic view on the gladiatorial sports. By the end of it, you'll hopefully have dozed off. There is nothing so ruinous to good character as to idle away one's time at some spectacle. Vices have a way of creeping in because of the feeling of pleasure that it brings. Why do you think that I say that I personally return from shows greedier, more ambitious, and more given to luxury, and I might add, with thoughts of greater cruelty and less humanity, simply because I have been among humans? The other day, I chanced to drop in at the midday games, expecting sport and wit, and some relaxation to rest men's eyes from the sight of human blood. Just the opposite was the case. Any fighting before that was as nothing. All trifles were now put aside. It was plain butchery. The men had nothing with which to protect themselves, for their whole bodies were open to the thrust, and every thrust told. The common people prefer this to matches on level terms or request performances. Of course they do. The blade is not parried by helmet or shield, and what use is skill or defense? All of these merely postpone death. In the morning, men are thrown to bears or lions, at midday to those who were previously watching them. The crowd cries for the killers to be paired with those who will kill them, and reserves the victor for yet another death. This is the only release the gladiators have. The whole business needs fire and steel to urge men on to fight. There was no escape for them. The slayer was kept fighting until he could be slain. Kill him! Flog him! Burn him alive! The spectators roared. Why is he such a coward? Why won't he rush on the steel? Why does he fall so meekly? Why won't he die willingly? Unhappy as I am, how have I deserved that I must look on such a scene as this? Do not, my Lucilius, attend the games, I pray you. Either you will be corrupted by the multitude, or, if you show your disgust, be hated by them, so stay away.